small local offices and their replacement by much larger operational premises, perhaps part of the distancing from the communities. And John Stafford earlier rightly celebrated probation's participation in community in an earlier time. We saw officers perhaps, and you may disagree, but as it seems to me, officers increasingly based in their offices and sometimes even office bound. And of course, the rise of the desktop computer. We saw the emergence of a new educational qualification for probation officers in the late 1990s, the Diploma in Probation Studies, the introduction of structured assessment instruments, which eventually found full fruition in OASIS, the what works era, responsivity, needs and risks, accredited programs, and probation increasingly wanting to evaluate itself in terms of its achievements, in terms of reduced reconviction. We then saw the emergence of offender management and the rise of risk and public protection. But one problem with this kind of recollection, and you could add to that list, I'm sure, and make lists of your own, is that it draws attention to novelty and change, and this can suppress continuities. It can mean that we lose sight of the golden thread. And I want to argue that some of the most important things about probation, the values that John Budd told us when Sue quoted him earlier, the values that we want to sustain and make sure inform the practice of the next phase of probation's history. I want to try to see what they might be and why they matter so much. So here's a slide with a very boring title, isn't it? You say that to anyone, they're going to fall asleep, and I won't ramble too much on this particular one. But 20 years ago, I was working as a senior probation officer in a busy office in the north of the city of Nottingham. It hadn't long been the case that the Criminal Justice Act 1991 had been passed, and you'll remember that national standards, or some of you will, that national standards were introduced around about that time to try to make sure that the Act was implemented. But already there were rumblings, even before the Act was fully implemented, there were rumblings of dissatisfaction. And in 1993, the Criminal Justice Act overturned some key elements of the 1991 legislation. We'd been told in 91 that we were going to be centre stage. If we were centre stage in Act 1, where were we going to be in the next Act? And then, of course, there was this factionalism with the Conservative Party, divided on Europe, divided on other things, nothing like as strong and united as they are nowadays, of course. And in those days, a lot of animosity within that party, and they did what Conservative parties often do. We may not know who we are, but we know who we're not. And what we're not is all these terrible people and the criminal justice and public order bundled together, a whole load of ne'er-do-wells from squatters to hunt protesters and all other people, and into this new piece of legislation. And then there was somebody you may remember called Michael Howard who said, well, probation isn't social work, so what's the point and relevance of social work training? So if we weren't social workers, what were we? And if social work values were being explicitly repudiated, what was going to come next? And we began to hear talk of community justice. That's a nice resonant term. Who could possibly be against it? And I think the fact that everybody from left and right thought community justice was a wonderful thing should already make us suspicious. We know they don't agree, and we don't agree with them sometimes. So if everyone's in favour of this, maybe it's because the term itself may be resonant, but is fairly vacuous. What, after all, is community justice? What its guiding values? Maybe, though, there was an opportunity to influence that. And Mike Nellis influentially said that what community justice might be would be characterised by opposition to custody, what he called anti-custodialism, a commitment to community safety, and also to restorative justice. And he and a number of other scholars of that generation, including my distinguished colleague Paul Senior, wrote and debated eloquently about these important matters. So what about this alignment between social work and probation? To me, it was, even at the time, I thought it was really ironic that probation was officially abandoning social work at just the time when government policy was insisting on the commonalities of those two professions. Case management, for example, was becoming more and more a feature of both probation and social work. So was the priority of risk and the protection of the vulnerable, assessment, partnership, multi-agency work. All these things were being emphasised in both probation and in social work. And on the left of this slide, you can see a set of social work values that were articulated. Anybody here remember Father Felix B. Beestek? Yeah, thank you. Beestek was very much the person that we studied. He wrote the definitive work, and he said, here are the defining values of social work. If you look now what the defining values of probation might be, I think you can see a really close alignment. Perhaps not an exact mapping, but nevertheless an affinity. So now when Beestek talked about individualization, recognizing people in the whole, in the round, as individuals in all the many ways in which they're different from one another, we nowadays prefer to talk about valuing diversity and challenging unfair discrimination. The importance of feelings is being reaffirmed by my friend and colleague Charlotte Knight and others, talking about emotional literacy. So these softer skills, pro-social modelling, the way in which emotional engagement, respect for persons, the things that we bring to endeavours like a multi-agency public protection arrangement that is over and above surveillance and monitoring and tracking, but represents that in order to get at the principle that in order to get the best out of people, you must treat them well. And probation, I think, continues to stand for that. Motivational skills, and then the idea of professional relationship and the therapeutic alliance, which is increasingly common. So as probation was ostentatiously kicking social work out of the front door, it was beginning to creep back again through the back door, even though it was articulated in a very different vocabulary. Self-determination, that was particularly sneered at. There was it Jews and Watts, Anne or Paul may be able to remind me, but the Jews and Watts report said, social work, self-determination. What on earth could self-determination, how could that be a guiding principle for offenders? But I think that what they're saying here is very close to what Sue Rex was getting at. Self-determination never meant, oh, well, if you want to abuse your children, that's cool, that's your right. What it did mean for social work and still means for probation is beautifully expressed here by Sue Rex. Offenders need to be addressed as active participants, not the passive recipients of punishment or treatment, and so forth. And David Smith reminded us that we can talk about punishment, we can talk about public protection, but when practitioners decide what they're actually going to do, to engage people, to motivate them, to deploy resources on their behalf, to give them a sense of hope in the possibility of change, because after all, in order to change we need hope as well as a push of discomfort. Probation staff will find themselves using ideas and skills that have emerged from social work theory and research. So these values, I think, find expression in practice. And the first bullet point I won't read out to you, read it for yourselves, says what some of those values are. Why? Because this is what it takes to do the job. If you try and behave in a significantly different way, you have no legitimacy, people won't come to see you, and you can wag your finger and you can threaten them with breach, but you get absolutely nowhere. So sometimes I think that when we talk about values, we should not regard them as merely an abstract set of precepts that we plonk down on practice and hope that it will guide practice, but values as emerging from principled, decent people trying hard to do the job in an honourable, efficient and decent manner. David Faulkner, one of my heroes and maybe one of yours, he said on the occasion of the centenary, liberal values and with them the probation service lost much of the respect they once enjoyed, and the present government's vision of the NPS is as an agency of public protection and an arm of government. But I would not care for a society, says David, or a criminal justice system from which liberal ideas were absent or the service's traditions were lost. So what are these liberal ideas? Well, here are, for me, some of them. We could each craft our individual lists. Scepticism about the worth and value of prison. Most probation staff I know are unpersuaded that prison works, that it contributes to making people better, that it makes a lot of difference to building a safer society. Many of us believe that, on the contrary, it tends to block all those factors that conduce to resistance. Skepticism about deterrence and coercion. We mostly believe that threatening people ain't great. It doesn't work very well, whether or not it's a proper thing to do. We believe in social inclusion. If the prison wall says, you are not us, probation says, you are us. And it's within this community that where you've started to offend and where you must find your path to desistance. The belief that Heather articulated so powerfully earlier, the belief in the possibility of change. And something that the American civil rights activist Brian Stevenson, a very eloquent and moving speaker, says, a belief that everyone is more than the worst thing they have ever done. That although it's customary and conventional to refer nowadays to offenders, that is reductively to define them in terms of their worst behaviour and to lose sight of the fact that those offences that they've committed have occurred in the context of a whole and rounded biography. And a biography, moreover, characterised by profound social disadvantage in more cases than not. Values enjoin us to do things, to behave in certain ways, but they also rule out certain things. So I think I felt it was useful to put up an opposing set of values, which I think are values intended to challenge. I've already spoken about them, but maybe the last three I can go through again. The idea that so far from social inclusion, offenders are not us. They shouldn't have opportunities, they don't deserve opportunities, certainly not while they're serving sentences, and maybe never. Some people are fundamentally evil and can't change, and people should be defined reductively as offenders. And for me, the liberal ideas, the liberal values that David Faulkner expressed, the column on the left, we oppose the principles and beliefs and prejudices on the right. How have we realised these principles in probation practice? Well, our opposition to prison, I think, arises from the proposing that non-custodial sentences should be employed wherever possible. It's still the case that the great majority of pre-sentence reports argue for proposals that do not involve custody. We believe in encouraging people and engaging people. We believe in enabling them to have access to social capital, and that underpins the whole idea of partnership, of course. And we believe in rehabilitative work, not giving up on people. And our studies, as Heather has said already this afternoon, have been enriched by desistance perspectives, our understanding of how these changes might take place. In a strong sense, values are what a profession does, and not just what it says. They're also not only about what we try to achieve, but how we go about it. So public protection is an admirable thing. People should be safe. But the way in which probation thinks that is accomplished, through engagement, through inclusion, through professional relationships, through motivation and encouragement, is very different from any belief that says it's mainly accomplished through hardware, through kit, through technology, through surveillance, through coercion, through threat. And it's the fact that these values do emerge from practice, they grow from the people doing the task, a difficult job in a principled way, that make them, I think, much more stubborn and much more resistant to change than may first appear. So it may be that other people have a different kind of vision for probation, but it seems to me that the practices of having to work with people who may choose not to work with you will inevitably generate much of these good things. I think there's a lot to be said for trying to articulate our beliefs in the language of human rights. Mike Nellis once said that social work values had no resonance with the public, and I'm sure that's right. I'm not too sure that human rights is terribly popular with the public. People have certainly heard of them, but they tend to attract a lot of sneering and scoffing. But nevertheless, they are an accepted international vocabulary for discussing ethical claims. They're justiciable, by which I mean they can be determined in court. If there's a dispute about what somebody's right actually entails, in principle at least, that can be determined in court. And they're international. And like John Stafford, I've gained an awful lot of optimism and encouragement from engaging with Europe, from recognising what we have in common with other jurisdictions. My feeling is that where there is a conflict between the rights of individuals and a politician's claim to be representing the public interest, politicians cannot safely be trusted to be judges in their own cause, and that the existence of an international community helps to keep us honest. So even as sometimes I might look at some judgments in Europe and think, well, I wonder why they took that decision, I nevertheless celebrate the process. Because if countries become too introspective and lose sight of those rights, I think that we enter a very dangerous world where politicians, in what they claim to be a national interest, can get away with all kinds of things. So, 18 minutes and 10 seconds, and I know you've got the lever, and I'm going to stop very shortly. Almost all the people that I've worked with in probation in my career that I can think of, they're just the same kind of cross-section as the rest of humanity. They're kind people and unkind people, and all the rich diversity of human conduct. If they have a thing in common, most of the ones I've worked with, is that they never really had a decent break in life. They haven't had opportunities. And what I think probation tries to do is to give them that opportunity to change. And that's why, because without those opportunities, change will not take place. When we hear of excellent work with veterans, of excellent work in public protection, probation staff are doing things that make a difference and not getting cross about public safety. So my time is up. I want to celebrate not only what probation has achieved, which is wonderful, but what it has tried to stand for. Thanks very much.